Greetings, and welcome to part 2 of our exploration of the Big Lie. In part 1, we discussed what it means and how it works. Now we move on to describe its effects, both social and financial. Later, in the final segment, we'll examine how it moves in major cycles through time, and how a group known as resistance investors manage to avoid its traps and protect their family savings. In case you haven't watched part 1 yet, I'll just note that in the United States, the expression "the big lie" only refers to some spoiled brat's tantrum about losing an election a few years ago. But in the rest of the world, it refers to a much bigger lie at the heart of global finance and of public governance generally, especially in the world's democracies. That bigger lie begins in world history. Natural disasters occur everywhere around the world, of course. But as if that weren't enough, we manage to compound those troubles by building economic mismanagement and political oppression right back on top of those very ruins. Some of us can avoid such upheavals simply by staying home. We enjoy a remarkable degree of privacy and freedom by sheer default. However, over the last few years, even when snug in our good fortune, we sense the tide of human migration swirling all around us. But as a nation that cuddles kids and kittens, we've become increasingly aware of millions of families on every continent forced to flee oppressive poverty and violence. Surely the least we can do from our positions of relative comfort is learn how the financial and political jargon industries pull the wool over our eyes, usually without us even realizing it. So, let's begin with a brief review of that vocabulary, especially the difference between numerals and numbers. We use plain numerals on a ruler to map the middle of an object or of a space. Used in that manner, numerals have no size at all. They're just labels, like our name or our phone number or the license number on our car. We would never add up our birth dates, for example, nor try to weigh our social security number. Those are just numerals. Financial and political tricksters replace the simple word middle with a jargon word, median, where they like to leave ordinary people behind while they slip away into a whole other language altogether. Their usual tactic for this diversion is to hold our attention in the middle, like a hypnotist telling us to keep our gaze locked on that stationary object, while they themselves slip to the side and reorganize the remaining symbols as amounts, as quantities, as number, not just numerals. If they're talking about the elite versus the poor, or Wall Street versus Main Street, or the upper class versus the lower class, they quietly, unobtrusively, cluster them separately and add them up as numbers, not numerals, as amounts. Let's take a closer look at this clever little stunt. Ask yourself, is the middle position on the numerals on the left the same as the middle amount between the numbers on the right? When we take time to look at this image carefully, we soon realize something is really wrong. Clearly, the position named 5 is not at all halfway between the amounts 30 and 10. And the consequences of that difference are absolutely enormous. They are the seeds of the much bigger lie, usually sown without our even noticing. The financial jargon industry flips into entirely new operations, new calculations, based on amounts, on number, leaving us and the vast majority of ordinary people behind, still thinking those calculations concern middles. They abandon the middle and instead lay the foundation for a whole new vocabulary based on something called the average. And a bit like when lower E's renamed middle as the median, upperish renames the average as the mean. And the jargon industry calculates that mean by adding up the group of numbers and dividing the total by how many items are in the group. In this illustration, the upper 4 numbers add up to 30, while the lower 4 numbers only add up to 10. And you can see the results are very different from the old median. Whether it concerns an average salary or an average speed or an average weight, what the jargon industry calls the mean is a whole nother idea. And with that clever sleight of tongue, we become increasingly tangled in the weeds of the financial jargon salad with which the mainstream financial press confuses Main Street, corrupts Wall Street, and manipulates modern democratic political parties, priorities, policies, and even elections. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. We're about to discover one of the central themes of all human history. This lie isn't just a transitory fib about some overweening adolescent cheating at golf or throwing a tantrum after losing an election. We're about to excavate the much bigger lie. How has our public conversation been hijacked? How have our choices, even our election campaigns, been reduced to a word game, to an advertising sham? It's time to take a look under the hood. Let me warn you, though. Brace yourself. You might end up pretty damned annoyed by how stupidly simple this all is. How clueless we've all been. Here's how that simple little stunt, the difference between median and mean, between middle and average, fools us all. Are you ready? Watch this. Take just enough from the lowers to make the 2 into a 1, the 3 into a 1, and the 4 into a 2. That leaves you with a little side stash of 5. Now slide it up and transfer it to the uppers. And all the while, proclaim you're maintaining a fair and unchanging middle. Of course, you're actually creating and then exacerbating a galloping gap between the uppers and lowers, between the haves and the have-nots, creating a deep, destructive tear in the social fabric between the median of Main Street and the ever more exclusive mean among the gated elites of Wall Street. Historically, such huge gaps have led to unrest, revolution, and even war. So how have the elites kept things quiet so much longer this time? Easily, it turns out. Biden speaks fluent upperese to distinguished Democrats who believe him when he says he'll raise the median only enough to quell the riots. And Trump lies through his teeth in the phoniest of fluent lowerese, seducing the clueless MAGA sheep into believing he'll actually lower the mean from himself and the elites. They both only widen the gap. And we're all left to wonder what terrible fibs they're both exploiting in our name behind closed doors. For over 100 years, Europe and North America thought insurrection and unrest were third world phenomena. No longer. No longer. The gap that prompted the guillotine in 1789, also beheaded the czars in 1917. It crippled the United States from 1929 right through the Great Depression. It turned China and India upside down in 1947 and 1949. And it resurfaced in Cuba in 1958. And although it was brutally crushed afterwards, it dominated the internet from Tunisia during the Arab Spring of 2011. From Mar-a-Lago to Myanmar, what on earth has happened to us? What led to George Floyd, to Vladimir Putin, to January 6th, and to the darlings of Davos? Amidst unrest and upheaval in Kyiv, Ramallah, Buenos Aires, and Mar-el-Laki, we wonder what century we're in, let alone whether we have a democracy, an oligarchy, or whether we risk outright fascism again. And that is what constitutes the big lie's first major impact: social and political unrest. The rampant urban conflict that we've seen recently, and the increasing threat of even more brutal international wars. Only a small minority of our neighbors truly understand these first impacts of the Great Gap. War veterans, people who've lived through the pain and scars of revolt and violent unrest. Unlike the big liars, we readily see the honesty in these veterans' eyes. We understand their skepticism about politics, and we crave the tough love guidance they might offer us during the turmoil ahead. In the remainder of this presentation, we turn our attention from social unrest to the second major impact of the big lie's Great Gap: financial turmoil. So severe that it has us checking our rainy day sock of emergency cash more often than ever before. As interest rates and food prices surpass decades-long trends, we hear that such worries are beginning to puzzle even the lofty elites in their heavily mortgaged mansions. The second intriguing scattering of ordinary citizens all around the world are those who specialize in the second impact of the lie's big gap. In the financial wars of the 21st century, these are the resistance fighters, people who hold the jargon industry in such contempt they provide a counterweight to the Bannon-like masters of rhetoric and logical fallacy who diddle Donnie Trump's phony populist buttons. They're neither populists nor elitists, nor do they pump and dump outrageous Ponzi schemes for personal profit or vested interests. Instead, they've stepped outside the huckster propaganda bubble to invest privately nearer the healthier and fairer economic median. They deliberately choose not to belly up to the inverted bankster funnel that siphons so much professional money into the financial stratosphere far above the mean. Moreover, they stand immune to the shenanigans of partisan politics. Many work from home, they report their income, they pay their taxes. They couldn't be bothered trying to manage a labyrinth of elitist loopholes just to cheat their way into a few extra pennies of offshore tax avoidance. Instead, they treasure the peace of mind that comes from applying simple investment principles honestly and in ways that defy Wall Street tricks. So let's conclude our review of the second consequence of the bigger lie, in other words, the financial wars of the 21st century, by looking inside the routines of these truly contrarian traders. As the rest of the world stampedes towards global unrest and insurrection, we're going to risk an occasional oversimplification and even stretch the odd metaphor, all in order to understand and learn from these dedicated resistance traders. As we explore their useful narratives, let's try to discern the broader moral to their stories rather than getting bogged down in the hair splittings of jargon jockey naysayers. Let's begin with something city dwellers recognize. Imagine one of those giddy moments on a busy sidewalk when we abruptly waver from side to side, trying to avoid a fellow pedestrian approaching from the opposite direction. We rarely actually collide with them, yet we feel silly and a little embarrassed before hurrying off without apology or even eye contact. Scientists have studied this phenomenon. They call it avoidance reflex. And apparently, our reactions vary with distance, velocity, and the size of the approaching person. Resistance traders recognize that behavior intimately. Those same zigzag twitches also apply at the very core of choppy, disorderly markets. Traders describe those oscillations using other names, such as time frames and volatility and liquidity, but they still need alerts and signals to avoid collisions, to adjust to the flow, and to reach their objectives without getting hurt. Just as in our sidewalk swerving analogy, or in the way Nervous beginning drivers sometimes careen from side to side from overcorrecting when learning to steer a car for the first time. Traders also risk getting caught when wild, choppy markets change direction too quickly for orderly entry and exit. Elite traders go to great lengths to front-run such changes, and they even buy insurance against unexpected reversals. If they're holding a sizable position in a certain investment, but feel nervous that a reversal is approaching, they'll often temporarily buy opposing assets like inverse electronic funds or put options in order to hedge against sudden reversals. Which leads to a counterintuitive reflex where the traders buy so much insurance at the points of inflection where they're afraid they might get hurt. But the amount of insurance they buy is so powerful and so effective that the underlying condition they were worried about begins to react, and those peaks and valleys they were worried about flatten out. And they get to the point as they approach the zero line where they've built up so much momentum that instead of bouncing and going back up again, they flip in the opposite direction and keep right on going, expanding again, but in the opposite direction, which produces a crazy situation where from never mind one day to the next, 1 hour to the next, let alone a day or a week or two, the entire market can flip from one direction to the other. And that is what traders call chop conditions, as opposed to investment conditions. And they call it chop for a good reason, because people can get badly chopped up. And those are the situations in which you will see on TV every night the financial jargon industry, the pundits and the experts and the advisors and government policy people and bank policy people madly scurrying to come up with narratives that can explain why they were wrong and why they're taking the opposite action from the ones they were recommending only weeks ago. That's what happened in 2000. That's what happened in 2008. We've all heard people talk about the subprime mortgage crisis and the great financial crisis. And last fall in the United States, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, the central bank, claiming that, don't worry about inflation, it's only transitory. And of course it then exploded to such an extent that he was madly rushing out every couple of weeks and raising interest rates, with all of the impacts that had. Like a broken analog clock that seems to get it right twice a day, only to make no sense at all moments later. The whole of global finance got it wrong in late 2023 and became even more confused and unsure of itself into early 2024. When markets ignore their own deeper underlying conditions like that and catapult back and forth in extreme directions, traditional investment strategies like cycles and trends and range edges and lines of support and resistance, they all fail terribly. They no longer provide reliable signals of when to enter or exit investment positions. What actually happens ends up running diametrically opposite to expert opinion and to public expectations. Vast numbers of vaunted experts, like insurance companies and pension funds, suffer tremendous losses, drawdowns as they're called. And that's when everyone turns to government to bail them out. Governments hound the banks to print more inflation, which government can then hurriedly borrow as additional debt to pay for just enough new unfunded infrastructure to subsidize transportation and construction billionaires and distract the restless hordes to postpone the revolution. This is where we hearken back to part 1 of this series, where the politics of mean meet the politics of median, to where the policies of growth meet the policies of inflation, and to where the priorities of the uppers dwarf the priorities of the lowers. Who were Robespierre and Benito Mussolini? Who are Steve Bannon and Donnie Trump? Each in their own era, who were the scriptwriters, the masters of a grand design? And who were the delusional puppets, the unwitting cult enforcers? Are we once again entering a dissolution phase in human history that, akin to Neil Howe's Fourth Turning, will usher in a difficult time of expurgation lasting a decade or more, but which will eventually yield conditions conducive to a new birth and a new mission? In the final analysis, if we intend to understand any of this ever again, we must figure out where we really are. Not so much which country or city we're in, but where the whole world is in its journey on the cycle of life. We need a map. We need a vocabulary. We need to understand a cycle so vast that we will no longer be swindled by jargon spewing from trillion-dollar troll factories. In part 3 of this series, we'll chunk up, far above both the big lie and the bigger lie, to explore a framework that includes the financial wars of the 21st century and perhaps other periods in human history that have seen troll factory pamphleteers script lies on behalf of crass and bellicose tyrants wanting to seduce Pied Piper simpletons in ways that have repeated all through history. This concludes part 2 of our series on the big lie. I'll look forward to seeing you for part 3. Bye for now.